Welcome to the final part of the history of the United States. Developed nuclear arsenals, giving rise to an arms race that led to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Space race. The Cold War also manifested in the space race, with the Soviet Union and the United States competing for milestones, such as the launch of the first satellite, Sputnik, and the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. Korea War, 1950-1953, Korean Division. After World War II, Korea was divided into two: North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and South Korea, backed by the United States. Korea War. It began in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. The war ended in an armistice in 1953, leaving the peninsula divided into the demilitarized area, McCarthyism and witch hunt, 1950s, hunting of communists. In the United States, there was a period of intense anti-communist persecution led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who accused people of being communists without substantial evidence. Decolonization and independence wars. Decolonization. Many colonies obtained independence during the Cold War, and superpowers often supported different sides in decolonization conflicts. Wars in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, which involved the Communist bloc in the North and the anti-Communist bloc in the South, was an emblematic conflict of the Cold War. Détente and distension, 1960s, 1970s. Starting. In the 1960s, there was a period of distension between the United States and the Soviet Union, marked by weapons control agreements and efforts to reduce tensions. Reagan and the Second Cold War, 1980s, Reagan and the arms race. President Ronald Reagan increased pressure on the Soviet Union, intensifying the arms race in the 1980s. End of the Cold War. At the end of the decade of 1980, the reforms in the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991. Coup d'etat in the Soviet Union. Civil rights movements. Civil rights movements in the United States were a series of organized efforts that took place mainly in the 1950s and 1960s to advocate equal rights and the elimination of racial segregation and systemic discrimination, especially against African Americans. Here are some of the key moments and leaders of civil rights movements. Boycott for Montgomery, 1955-1956. Rosa Parks. On December 1, 1955. Rosa Parks, an African American, refused to give up her seat. On a bus to a Target in Montgomery, Alabama, triggering the boycott to Montgomery's bus. Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a boycott leader and advocated non-violent resistance against racial segregation. March in Washington for Work and Freedom, 1963. Speech, I Have a Dream. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. pronounced his famous speech, I Have a Dream, during the March in Washington for Work and La Libertad, an event that brought together thousands of protesters seeking racial equality. Civil Rights Law of 1964, End of Legal Segregation. The Civil Rights Law of 1964 ended racial segregation in public facilities and prohibited discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or the national origin. Right voters, 1965, Voting Rights Law of 1965. The Voting Rights Law of 1965 was a milestone in the fight for civil rights and sought to eliminate the barriers that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote, as literacy tests and electoral taxes. Activist murders, Martin Luther King Jr., 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed on April 4, 1968. Which generated shock and sadness, but also revived the commitment to the cause of civil rights. Malcolm X, 1965, African American leader. Malcolm X was killed in February 1965, highlighting tensions within the movement for civil rights and the different strategies adopted by their leaders. Civil rights movement in education. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The decision of the United States Supreme Court in the Brown v. case. Board of Education declared racial segregation in unconstitutional public schools, ending the concept of separate but equal school integration. Despite the decision, school integration faced resistance in many places, which led to events such as the integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962, Chicano movement, Mexican-American activism. The Chicano movement sought equal rights and justice for Americans of Mexican descent in areas such as education and employment. The Strike of Delano, 1965-1970. The Strike of Delano, led by Cesar Chavez and the Association of Agricultural Workers, UFW, sought to improve the working conditions of Mexican-American agricultural workers. LGBTQ+ movement, Stonewall, 1969. Stonewall disturbances in New York in 1969 were a turning point in the LGBTQ movement, marking the beginning of a more visible struggle for civil rights and acceptance. These civil rights movements significantly transformed American society and laid the foundations for greater equality and justice in the country. Although important advances were made, the struggle for civil rights continues today in various ways. Vietnam War, 1955-1975. The Vietnam War was a complex conflict that took place in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1955 to the fall of Saigon in 1975. It involved various forces and became a significant focus of the War of the War-Fria, with the United States and other Western nations supporting the government of southern Vietnam in its fight against the communist forces of northern Vietnam and the National Liberation Front, known as Viet Cong. Here are some key aspects of the Vietnam War. Background: Vietnam. Division. After the withdrawal of the French in 1954, after the defeat in Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam was divided into the 17th parallel, with the North governed by communists led by Ho Chi Minh and the South by a government backed by USA. Meeting objective. Both the North and the South sought the gathering of the country under their own political system. United States participation, initial support. United States provided military advice and financial aid to the South government since the 1950s as part of its policy to contain communist expansion, Truman Doctrine. Development of the military presence. As the situation worsened in the South, the U.S. military presence gradually increased, culminating in the massive deployment of troops in the 1960s. War climb, Tonkin and Gulf Resolution, 1964. The incident of the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964 led to the United States Congress to approve the resolution of the Gulf of Tonkin, which granted President Lyndon B. Johnson broad powers to use the military force in Vietnam. Rolling Thunder Operation. An American air bombing campaign on northern Vietnam intensified over the years. War of Guerrillas and Tunnels of Viet Cong. Viet Cong Tactics. Viet Cong's forces, supported by the North, used guerrillas and underground tunnels to resist U.S. operations and Southern government. Tet Offensive, 1968. Surprise attacks. In the new year of 1968, Tet, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces, launched a series of surprise attacks throughout the country. Impact on public opinion. Although the United States and its allies repelled the offensive, media coverage and significant losses influenced American public opinion, increasing the opposition to war. United States Withdrawal and Peace Agreement, 1973. Nixon and Vietnamization. President Richard Nixon implemented the Vietnamization policy, which implied the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and the transfer of war responsibility for war on forces of the South. Paris Peace Agreement. In 1973, a peace agreement was signed in Paris that provided for the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the release of prisoners of war. However, the fight continued between the North and the South. Fall of Saigon, 1975. Northern Offensive. In 1975, the Nor-Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive that led to the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, marking the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under the communist government. Consequences: human and material costs. Vietnam's war resulted in the loss of millions of lives, both military and civilians, and caused huge material damage. Impact on the United States. War had a deep impact on American society, generating protests and distrust of government. Durable legacy. The Vietnam War left a lasting legacy in American foreign policy and the way in which military intervention is perceived. The Vietnam War was a complex and controversial conflict that had repercussions globally and left a deep mark on the history of the 20th century. It was contemporary. The contemporary era refers to the most recent era in history, characterized by significant events and developments that have taken place from the end of the 19th century to the present. This era encompasses a period of rapid and deep changes in society, politics, technology, and culture. Here are some key aspects of the contemporary era. Industrial revolutions, 19th century. First Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 18th and early 19th century, the First Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom began, marked by advances in machinery, mining, and textile production. Second Industrial Revolution. In the mid-19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution brought advances in metallurgy, chemistry, and electricity, further transforming production and transport. Imperialism and colonization, 19th century or early 20. Career for Africa and Asia. European powers carried out the colonization of vast areas in Africa and Asia, looking for resources and markets. Consequences: imperialism had deep economic, cultural, and political consequences for both colonial powers and colonized regions. World Wars, 20th century. World War I, 1914-1918. A global conflict that involved many nations with significant consequences, including maps redouble and the creation of the League of Nations. Meanward period, a period of instability and social change that followed the First World War. World War II, 1939-1945. Another global conflict, this time more devastating, which involved the main powers of the world and led to the emergence of the Cold War. Cold War, 1947-1991, division of the world. Cold War was an ideological and political confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, which divided the world into Western and Eastern blocs. Armamentist and space carrera. Both superpowers competed in a nuclear arms race and spatial achievements, such as the arrival of man to the moon in 1969. Decolonization, mid-20th century. End of imperialism. After World War II, many colonized countries achieved independence, marking the end of the imperial era and the emergence of new national states. Civil rights movements, 20th century. Civil rights in the United States. Movements such as civil rights in the United States sought racial equality and the elimination of segregation, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. Globalization, the end of the century. Access news. Technological advances. The development of information and communications technologies has led to an unprecedented global interconnection. Global economy. Globalization has transformed economies, facilitating international trade and capital mobility. Social and cultural changes, 20th century news. Social movements. Various social movements have arisen, addressing issues such as women's rights, LGBTQ rights, the environment, and social justice. Cultural change, music, cinema, fashion, and other forms of popular culture have experienced significant changes, reflecting and contributing to the evolution of society. Contemporary challenges. Climate change. Climate change is a global challenge that has led to discussions about sustainability and environmental policies. Technology and ethics. Technological advances such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology raise ethical and social questions. inequalities. Economic and social disparities have led to a greater approach to matters of equity and justice. The contemporary era is a dynamic and complex period that continues to evolve with unique challenges and opportunities in human history.